Hey everyone. And before we start, I just want to give a huge, heartfelt thank you to all of you, especially my viewers in the States, for choosing to spend your time here with my family's story. The support has been, well, it's been everything. So if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, please consider hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. All right, let's get into it. This was my grandma, Aliner. To the world, and to me for most of my life, she was the perfect grandmother. The smell of freshly baked bread and old books followed her like a shadow, a scent that meant safety, comfort, and unconditional love. Her hugs could fix just about anything, from a scraped knee to a teenage heartbreak. She was my safe place, my sanctuary in a world that often felt too loud and too fast. But people, they're like old houses, aren't they? With grand living rooms where laughter echoes, but also with dusty, boarded up attics and locked cellars holding things no one speaks of. My grandma had a room like that. Except it wasn't just a room, it was a locked trunk in the attic. And the key to it was hidden my entire life. When she passed away, I thought I was just inheriting her house, a building filled with a lifetime of sweet memories and fading floral wallpaper. I was wrong. She left me a clue that led to a key, which unlocked that trunk, and a secret so dark it had been buried for over 70 years. A story of forbidden love, a devastating tragedy, and a family scandal so profound, they tried to erase a life from existence. And I've come to realize this wasn't just a story she wanted me to know. This was her final, silent wish for the truth. Part 1: The Inheritance. The days after the funeral were a thick, gray fog, blurring the edges of reality. The sympathy cards piled up on the mantelpiece, their elegant cursive condolences, with deepest sympathy, so sorry for your loss, all blending into one meaningless platitude. Kind hearted neighbors came and went, leaving casseroles in the fridge that I had no appetite to eat, their contents congealing under plastic wrap. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about what a wonderful woman and a true lady Alina was, and I would nod, a hollow feeling echoing in my chest. Because none of them truly knew her. The chilling realization dawning on me was that I didn't either. The house itself seemed to be grieving. The floors creaked with a sorrowful weight under my feet. The afternoon light, slanting through the dusty windows where she used to sit, seemed weary and thin. Her favorite armchair, with the impression of her body still faintly visible in the cushions, felt like a shrine to a ghost. The silence was the loudest sound, a roaring emptiness where her quiet humming or the rustle of a turning page should have been. It was into this fragile quiet that my great uncle Arthur came. He didn't knock, just let himself in with the key he had, his presence an immediate intrusion. I heard his heavy, purposeful footsteps on the hardwood floor of the hall before I saw him. He found me in the living room, staring at a wall of photographs, a gallery of smiling, captured moments that now felt like a mockery of time's cruelty. He was holding a sleek leather briefcase that looked completely alien amongst my grandmother's chintz floral furniture and doilies. Clara, there you are. I was hoping I'd find you in. How are you holding up? I'm all right, Uncle Arthur. It was a lie, a social grease we applied to keep the machinery of conversation from grinding to a halt. He didn't press. I could tell from his restless energy that he wasn't here for my emotional state. He was here for business. Good, that's good. Listen, I know this is a difficult time, but we need to be pragmatic. I've taken the liberty of speaking to a realtor. Howard Vance, best in the county, works with all the high-end estates. He's very optimistic about the market right now. Thinks we can get this place sold, settled before the first frost. He said it all so smoothly, so matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing a stock portfolio that needed rebalancing. He paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, his gaze sweeping the room, but not in a sentimental way. He was assessing it, appraising it. I could almost see the dollar signs clicking behind his eyes as he looked at the original crown molding, the solid oak floors, the large bay window. He wasn't seeing a home, he was seeing assets. Sold. Uncle Arthur, the funeral was 4 days ago. I haven't even gone through her photo albums yet. I can't think about selling her house. My voice was barely a whisper. The thought felt like a physical blow. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression one of carefully practiced patience. The kind a parent uses on a difficult, irrational child, and that's why I'm here, to handle the unpleasant details, to take the burden off your shoulders. Your grandmother, above all else, was a practical woman. She wouldn't want you saddled with an old house. The upkeep alone. Clara, you have no idea. The property taxes, the heating bills, the plumbing in these old homes is a nightmare waiting to happen. She would want you to take the inheritance, a considerable sum, I might add, and use it to build your own future, not to be anchored to her past. This house is my past, too. It's not an anchor, it's all I have left of her. My voice cracked on the last few words. That's just the grief talking, and that's understandable. But sentimentality is a luxury that can be very, very expensive. Howard, the realtor, said he could come by tomorrow. Just for a preliminary look, no commitments. He smiled, a thin, unconvincing gesture. The pressure was gentle but relentless, like a rising tide of ice water. Every word was designed to make me feel small, impractical, overly emotional. He was framing his haste as a kindness, a favor to me, the capable man taking charge for the hysterical young woman. But it felt suffocating. It felt like an attempt to scrub the memory of her from the earth as quickly as possible, to liquidate her life and turn it into a neat, tidy number on a bank statement. I looked at this man, my grandmother's brother, the man who had always sent a crisp $50 bill for my birthday, and for the first time I saw a stranger. A stranger with an agenda I couldn't yet comprehend. Part 2. Whispers from next door. I managed to put Arthur off, telling him I needed at least a month, that I couldn't make any decisions through the fog of grief. He left with a sigh of thinly veiled disapproval, patting my shoulder in a way that felt more like a warning than a comfort, reminding me again not to be guided by emotion. His visit left me agitated, the quiet grief of the house now replaced by a humming, anxious suspicion. To escape the feeling, I went out to the front porch, just to breathe air that wasn't thick with the past and the scent of his expensive cologne. I was mindlessly deadheading my grandmother's geraniums, their pink heads drooping sadly in their terracotta pots, when Mrs. Peterson from next door waved at me from her porch swing. She was a fixture of the neighborhood, a woman whose memory was as long and tangled as the roots of the ancient oak tree that separated our properties. "Hello, dear. It's good to see you up and about. It's a hard thing. A hard, quiet thing. Losing a mother is one thing, but a grandmother. That's a special kind of silence they leave behind. It is. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, it really is." She took a slow sip of her iced tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "I was just thinking about your grandmother this morning. I remember when she first moved into this house with your grandfather. Seems like a lifetime ago. She was always a good neighbor, kept to herself, but always had a kind word. She was a very quiet woman. Was she always like that? Quiet? I only ever knew her as this calm, gentle person." The question slipped out before I could stop it. It was a baited hook cast into the deep waters of the past. "Mrs. Peterson looked at me, her sharp blue eyes assessing me for a long moment over the rim of her glass before she decided to bite. "Oh, heavens no. Don't let the end of a story fool you about the beginning. When Alina Harrison was a girl, 16, 17 Lord, she was a firecracker. A real spitfire. She had this laugh that would just burst out of her, a full-throated thing that made you want to laugh too, even if you didn't know the joke. She had a light in her, a bright, burning light. I leaned forward, my own grandmother's sad geraniums forgotten. What happened to it? She sighed, a long, slow exhalation of breath, and set her glass down with a soft click. She leaned against her fence. Life happened, dear. This town happened. Her father happened. And a boy named Daniel Sullivan happened. A boy who was from the wrong side of the tracks, as they used to say. His father was a coal miner, his hands permanently stained black. Daniel was an artist, always sketching, with charcoal smudges on his fingers and a smile that could charm a snake. Her father, Councilman Harrison, he was a man made of pride and public opinion, all iron and starch. He couldn't abide it. He saw the boy as a stain on his family's good name, a threat to the perfect image he had crafted. So he made them break up. Oh, it was more than that. It was a war. There was a terrible row. The whole town whispered about it for weeks. The boy disappeared practically overnight, sent away somewhere. And after that, the light in a leaner just went out. It flickered for a while, but it was never the same. She learned to be quiet. She learned to be invisible. She married your grandfather a year later, a respectable man her father approved of. It was a tragedy what they did to that girl's spirit, a real tragedy. She gave me a sad, knowing smile. You have a good heart, Clara, just like she did before they taught her not to use it. She went back inside, leaving me on the porch with a new piece of the puzzle. A name, Daniel Sullivan, and the chilling, heartbreaking image of my grandmother's light being extinguished by the men who were supposed to protect her. Part 3. The key and the riddle. That night, sleep was impossible. The names Daniel and Sullivan played a repeating loop in my mind. The house felt different again. The gentle sadness was gone, replaced by a sense of creeping injustice. I felt like a detective who had just been handed her first real clue. I needed to find something, some proof, some acknowledgement of this story that had been so thoroughly, brutally erased. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I had to search. I started in her study, a dusty repository of forgotten things. I went through her desk, finding only old bills and checkbook stubs. I looked through her bookshelves, pulling out volumes of poetry and history, shaking them gently, hoping a forgotten letter might fall out. Nothing. Stacks of old magazines, boxes of tax records, a collection of stamps. Nothing. I moved to the basement, with its damp, earthy smell and its shelves of preserved fruits in dusty mason jars, each with a neatly handwritten label. Nothing. Finally, defeated and exhausted, I went back to the study. It felt like the heart of the mystery, the command center of the family's public image. My eyes were drawn to the large, imposing oil portrait of my great-grandfather, Councilman Harrison, that hung over the fireplace. He stared out from the canvas with cold, unforgiving eyes, a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness. The artist had perfectly captured the iron Will Mrs. Peterson had described. Where would a person hide a memory? Where would you put the one piece of a story you weren't allowed to tell, but couldn't bear to destroy? I stood on a chair and ran my hand along the heavy, ornate gold frame. And then, on a whim, I reached behind it. My fingers traced the rough canvas backing, a place no one would ever see or clean, and I felt it. A small, square bulge secured under a layer of brittle, yellowed tape. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. It was a slow, painstaking process to peel the tape away without it crumbling to dust. Finally, a small, heavy, cold object fell into my palm. A key. It was made of dark, rusted iron with an ornate, heart-shaped head. It was a key from a fairy tale or a nightmare. With it was a folded envelope, so old the paper was the color of weak tea. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unfold the single sheet inside. Her handwriting was there, elegant as always, but shaky, as if each word was a monumental effort. It wasn't a letter. It was a riddle, a final, cryptic command. In the dust where memories sleep, beneath the gaze that never weeps, my greatest truth is locked away. Forgive me, I read it over and over. The gaze that never weeps. My great grandfather's portrait. The key wasn't for some forgotten shed, it was for the attic, in the dust where memories sleep. And the old trunk she had told me stories about as a child, the one she said held treasures from long ago. And she was asking for forgiveness. For what? For the secret she kept, or for the burden she was now placing on me? I didn't know, but I knew I had no choice but to follow it to the end. Part 4: The Guardian of the Lie. I sat on the floor of my grandmother's study for what felt like hours, the iron key cold and heavy in my palm, the cryptic note lying next to me on the worn rug. The silence of the house was no longer just sad, it was charged, thrumming with the energy of a secret on the verge of being told. I knew what I had to do next. It wasn't just about finding what was in the trunk. It was about understanding the lie that had guarded it for so long. And there was only one guardian of that lie still living. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Uncle Arthur's name in my contacts. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. What was my plan? To accuse him? He would deny everything, call me hysterical, and I had no proof yet, just a key and a riddle. No, I couldn't confront him directly. I had to test him. I had to walk him to the edge of the lie and see if he would jump or if he would try to push me away. I took a deep breath, steadied my hand, and pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and impatient. Clara, is everything all right? Yes, everything's fine. I was just calling about the house. I was looking at the old portrait of great grandfather and I was wondering, did Grandma ever talk about him? About what the town was like when she was young? I started with a harmless question, a piece of bait. I could almost hear him relax on the other end of the line, settling into the role of the knowledgeable elder, the keeper of the official family history. Your great grandfather, a fine man, a pillar of this community. He built a good life for his family, a respected name. It was a different time, of course, simpler. People valued decorum, family honor. Your grandmother was a good daughter. Quiet, respectful, she understood her place. Quiet, respectful, the same words he used before, a carefully curated, approved narrative. Now for the real test. I was thinking about going through the old trunk in the attic. She always said it held treasures. It might be nice to see what's in there. A pause, not a long one, but a fraction of a second of dead air that was more telling than any word. A silence so loud it buzzed in my ear. That old thing. Heavens, it's probably full of moths and mildew. We lost the key to it decades ago, when your grandfather was still alive. It's just full of old linens, probably worthless by now. Honestly, Clara, it's best just to leave it be. You don't want to be breathing in all that dust. I see. It's strange, though, I found a key, taped behind great grandfather's portrait. This time the silence was longer. It was a weighted silence, the kind where you can hear the gears turning in someone's mind, clicking through options, calculating risks, constructing new walls. His voice, when it returned, was coated in a thick, syrupy layer of feigned concern. A key? Clara, what have you been getting up to? I hope you're not letting your imagination run away with you. You're grieving. It's perfectly natural to become a bit fixated on things, to look for meaning where there is none. An old key could be for anything. It means nothing. Your grandmother was probably just tidying up and put it there. It's a key to nothing. It was with a note from her. It said her greatest truth was locked away. She wanted me to find it. That was it. The final move. I had laid all my cards on the table. The reaction was instantaneous. The mask of calm concern melted away, replaced by the raw, hot anger of a man whose authority, whose entire version of reality had been challenged. A note? For God's sake, Clara, are you listening to yourself? A note. Your grandmother was an 85-year-old woman. Her mind was not what it once was. She was getting sentimental, confused. Are you going to build a fantasy around the ramblings of a sick old woman? Is that how you want to remember her? By entertaining this nonsense? It didn't seem like nonsense to me. It seemed important. My voice was quiet but firm. Important? I'll tell you what's important. What's important is preserving the dignity of her memory. What's important is being practical and responsible. What's important is that you stop acting like a child playing detective and listen to me. I am the executor of this family's estate and its legacy. I am telling you for your own good and out of respect for your grandmother, you will drop this. You will not open that trunk. Am I making myself clear? It was an order, a threat veiled as protection. The fury in his voice was the sound of pure panic. He wasn't guarding her dignity. He was guarding a lie. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever that lie was, it was locked inside that trunk. I murmured a quiet okay and ended the call, my hand shaking with adrenaline. The test was complete. The guardian had revealed himself. After the call with Arthur, the house felt too small, its walls too close. I was filled with a nervous, defiant energy. I grabbed the heavy iron key, its rust leaving a red stain on my palm, and pulled down the folding stairs to the attic. The air that flowed out to meet me was the first true thing I had experienced all week. It was thick and heavy, carrying the complex perfume of profound neglect. It smelled of dry, hot wood, of brittle paper, of dust mites, and a century of trapped time. It was the smell of a sealed room, of a story that had been suffocating in the dark. I climbed the rickety stairs, the wood groaning under my weight. The world was different here. The light was different, a single, bare bulb casting long, distorted shadows that made familiar objects seem monstrous. The silence was different, too. It wasn't the empty silence of the house. It was a deep, waiting silence, heavy with unspoken words. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things. A dressmaker's dummy, without a head, stood in one corner like a sentinel. Stacks of yellowed newspapers declared headlines from wars long over. A child's tricycle with one wheel missing leaned against a wall, a relic of a childhood I never knew. And there, in the center of the room, like a great, dark tomb, was the trunk. It was a massive steamer trunk, bound with leather straps that had cracked with age and brass fittings that were tarnished green. This was the sanctuary of ruin. It was a place that had been deliberately, meticulously sentenced to silence. I walked slowly, my feet stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the single beam of light like frantic spirits. I knelt before the trunk. I ran my hand over its rough, domed lid. I was trying to absorb the story of the place through my skin. I could feel the sorrow here. It was in the air, in the dust. It was a place of immense beauty and immense violence. The quiet violence of erasure. I took a deep breath, the iron key feeling cold and alien in my hand. It was a piece of the past forced into the present. Part 6. The Trunk and the Tin Box. The key slid into the brass lock with a grating sound, as if disturbing a long sleep. I had to put my shoulder into it, turning with all my strength. For a moment, there was only resistance, the unyielding stubbornness of 70 years of stillness. Then, a sound like a bone snapping. A sharp, percussive click as the inner workings of the lock finally surrendered. I lifted the heavy lid. It moved with a low, agonizing groan, like a great beast waking from a long slumber. I looked inside. The top layer was a neatly folded wedding dress, yellowed to the color of old ivory, the lace fragile as a butterfly's wing. It was my grandmother's, the dress she wore to marry the man her father chose for her. A symbol of the life she was forced to live. Beneath it were blankets smelling of cedar and thyme. I lifted them out one by one. And then I saw it. Nestled in the center of the trunk, like a buried heart in a broken chest, was a small tin box. It was a simple biscuit tin, rusted at the seams, the cheerful illustration of a pastoral scene of sheep in a meadow, almost completely obscured by age and decay. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a shoebox for a child's shoes. I reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked, its weight both physical and symbolic. I didn't open it there. It felt wrong, like a desecration. This was a private grief, and I needed to bring it back into the light. I carried it carefully, with both hands, as if it were a fragile, sleeping creature. The walk back down the attic stairs felt different now. I was no longer an explorer. I was a pallbearer. I placed the box on the clean, sun-drenched surface of the kitchen table. The contrast was jarring. The box was an object of darkness and decay, an artifact from the underworld, now sitting in the heart of my grandmother's warm, cheerful kitchen. I spent a long time just looking at it. I tried to pry the lid open with my fingers, but it was sealed shut by time and rust. I found a butter knife in a drawer and began to work it into the seam, carefully, painstakingly. The sound of the metal scraping against the rusted tin was the only sound in the house. With each small movement, my anticipation grew until it was a painful pressure in my chest. Finally, with a last, wrenching twist, the seal broke with a groan of protest. The lid came loose. I paused, took a deep, shuddering breath, and lifted it off. I looked inside. The smell of dust, of dry paper, of time itself, rose up to meet me. It was an urn, filled not with ashes, but with the preserved remnants of a life that was never lived. Part 7, The Relics. The past has a scent. It's not just the musty smell of age. It's the dry, papery scent of memory itself, of emotions trapped in fiber and celluloid for decades. That was the scent that rose from the tin box. I stood there for a long moment, simply breathing it in, preparing myself for what I was about to see. This was a tomb, and I was its sole visitor. With hands that felt strangely disconnected from my body, I reached inside. The first thing my fingers touched was something impossibly soft and light. I lifted it out into the light of the kitchen. It was a lock of hair, fine and pale as spun moonlight, tied with a simple blue silk ribbon that had faded to the color of a hazy sky. A baby's first curl. I held it in the palm of my hand. It weighed nothing, yet it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. This was a physical piece of a person who had lived and breathed in this house. I imagined my grandmother's young hands, her fingers carefully tying this ribbon, her heart swelling with the simple, fierce pride that only a mother can know. An act of love, an act of preservation. A hopeful promise, saved in a tin box buried in the dark. I placed the lock of hair gently on the table, as if it might turn to dust, and reached back into the box. My fingers closed around something solid and cool. A pair of tiny leather shoes. They were stiff with age, the leather cracked like drought-ridden earth. The laces were gone. They were so small, they fit entirely in the palm of my hand. They were the most heartbreaking things I had ever seen. Shoes are for journeys, for taking first steps, for toddling across a lawn, for running into a mother's arms. These shoes had been meant for a life of forward momentum, but their journey had ended here in this box. I turned one over and saw, on the tiny leather sole, a faint scuff mark near the toe. He had worn them. The baby had worn these shoes. He had kicked his feet, maybe even tried to stand. He was not just a lock of hair. He was a body in motion, a life brimming with potential, a journey cut short. The immensity of that loss, embodied in this tiny, scuffed shoe, was staggering. Beneath the shoes lay a photograph. A square photograph with the scalloped edges of a bygone era. I picked it up. The black and white image was faded, but the faces were clear, and my breath caught in my throat. I was looking at a woman I did not know. She looked like my grandmother, but it was a version of her from a different universe. This woman, this girl, was maybe 19. Her face was rounder, unlined by worry, and her smile. It was not the gentle, sad smile I knew. This was a smile of pure, uninhibited, radiant joy. A joy so powerful it seemed to light up the photograph from within. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her entire being, her whole world was tilted downwards, focused on the baby cradled in her arms. A chubby, beautiful baby with a shock of light hair and a serious expression, held so securely, so lovingly. This was a leaner before the quiet. This was a leaner before the sadness. This was the woman whose light misses. Peterson had told me about. And seeing her like this, so full of life and love, made the reality of the quiet, subdued woman she became even more of a crime. What could possibly have happened to extinguish such a brilliant light? What darkness could be so absolute? The answer, I suspected, lay at the bottom of the box. There was one last item, folded into a neat, tight square. A document. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the creases. I unfolded it with the care of a historian handling an ancient manuscript. It was a birth certificate from the county clerk's office. The typed, impersonal letters stood in stark contrast to the emotional weight of the other objects. I read the words and the world tilted on its axis. Name of child Leo Harrison. I whispered his name aloud. Leo, a ghost with a name, an official government sanctioned name. He was real. Name of mother, Eleanor Harrison, my grandmother. It was true, all of it. Name of father, Daniel Sullivan. There it was, the name Mrs. Peterson had whispered. The name that had made my Uncle Arthur's voice turn to ice. The missing piece, the motive. This single sheet of paper was the nexus of the entire secret, the concrete proof of a story that my entire family had conspired to deny, to erase, to bury in the dark. The betrayal I felt was a physical thing, a cold stone in my stomach. They had all lied. For 70 years, they had all been guardians of this lie. And then I saw what lay beneath the spot where the certificate had been. The foundation of the entire collection. Three small, identical books bound in dark, cracked leather. They weren't relics of the baby. They were relics of the mother. They were her testimony. The objects had shown me what had been lost. These diaries, I knew, would tell me how. With a deep, trembling breath that felt like I was about to plunge underwater, I reached for the first one. Part 8, The Gospel of a Leaner. The world outside, the kitchen window disappeared. The hum of the refrigerator faded. My own life, my own time, dissolved as I opened the first diary. The pages were filled with my grandmother's elegant, youthful script, the ink a faded blue-black. This wasn't just a record of events. It was a confession, a love letter, a scream of rage, a prayer of grief. I didn't just read it. I fell into it. The first diary began in the spring of 1950. It was filled with the breathless, heart-pounding excitement of first love. She wrote about Daniel, not as a boy with charcoal on his fingers, but as a kind of god. April 12th, 1950. Daniel gave me his favorite charcoal pencil today. He said it had created his best work, and now he wanted it to create mine. My heart beat so fast I thought I would faint. Father would kill me if he knew. He says the Sullivans are nothing but trouble, that they're beneath us. He doesn't understand. Daniel isn't beneath us. He's from a different world, a world where people are real, where they create with their hands and dream with their whole hearts. He's my everything. I could feel her defiance, her youthful certainty. She wrote about their secret meetings by the creek, about the plans they made to escape our small, suffocating town. She wrote about the first time he kissed her, how the world seemed to stop. And then the tone began to change. The fear began to creep in at the edges of the pages. July 16th, 1950. My brother Arthur saw us today. We were just walking by the creek, holding hands. He didn't say anything. He just stood on the path and watched us, his face hard and closed. It was the look on his face. It wasn't just disapproval, it was disgust. He looked at me like I was something dirty, something that had betrayed our family's good name. I saw my father in his eyes. It made me cold all over. I turned the page, and the next entry was from 3 months later. The ink was darker, the letters pressed harder into the paper. October 5th, 1950. I have missed my monthly. I am sick every morning. I know what it means. I was so scared I couldn't breathe. I thought Daniel would leave me. I thought my life was over. I told him tonight by the old oak tree, my voice shaking so much I could barely speak. He didn't run, he didn't get angry. He fell to his knees and put his hands on my stomach and he cried, tears of pure joy. He held me so tight and promised we would run away, get married, and build a life for our baby. He said he would sell his sketches to support us. We're going to name him Leo. For the first time, my fear turned into hope. We could do this. We could have our own world, but their world was not their own. It belonged to her father. The second diary was a testament to that. It was a chronicle of a war, one she was destined to lose. I read about the confrontation, about the day her world was torn apart. She described it in excruciating, vivid detail. March 20th, 1951. It's over. A living nightmare. Father found my letters. He and Arthur confronted Daniel at his house. I heard the shouting from the road. I ran. I saw my father wave a piece of paper in Daniel's face. He called him trash. He said he'd have him arrested for corrupting a minor. He said he would ruin his family. Arthur just stood there, behind father, like a soldier. They put Daniel on a bus and sent him away to an uncle in another state. Arthur held my arm as the bus pulled away. I was screaming his name. I was fighting, scratching at him. He just held on, his grip like iron, his face a mask of cold duty. He just said, "It's for your own good, Aliner. You'll thank us one day." I will never thank him. I will die hating him for what he did today. The final diary was the slimmest. Its pages were few, and many were stained with what I knew were tears. It was a gospel of grief. It chronicled the secret birth, the stolen moments of joy in the attic, the constant fear of discovery. And then the final entry. The entry for August 10th, 1951. The handwriting was barely legible, a wild, jagged scrawl. It was the sound of a soul being shattered into a million pieces. It described a fever, a sickness that came on fast. It was the story of how her son was erased by pride. And as I read the final, chilling words, his fever burned for 2 days. Father refused to call the doctor. He called it a sickness of sin. They let him burn. They buried my son in the dark while I was locked in my room. They told me to forget, but a mother never forgets. I knew my next destination. The time for testing the lie was over. It was time to confront the liar. Part 9. The confrontation. When I finally closed the last diary, my grandmother's kitchen was no longer a warm, familiar space. It had become a courtroom. The walls were a silent, judging jury. The overhead light was an interrogation lamp. And I was no longer a grieving granddaughter. I was a witness. No, I was more. I was the embodiment of her vengeance, a vengeance that didn't demand blood but demanded truth. The sorrow inside me had crystallized. It had become something cold and sharp and heavy. It was rage. A pure, righteous rage, 70 years in the making. I didn't wipe the tears from my face. I let them dry there like war paint. I picked up my car keys. I didn't take the diaries. I didn't need them. Every single word was now seared into my mind. Driving to Uncle Arthur's house, the world outside the window seemed unreal. The familiar streets, the neat houses, the manicured lawns, it was all part of a grand stage play, a performance of normalcy and respectability, masking the rot underneath. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. I didn't have to. I wouldn't be using my words. I would be using hers. I parked across the street from his perfect brick house. I didn't go to the front door. I walked around the side, to the back patio where he often sat to read in the evenings. And there he was, in a cushioned wicker chair, a glass of iced tea sweating on a small table beside him. He was reading a financial magazine, completely absorbed in his world of numbers and profits. A clean, orderly world. I stepped onto the flagstones of the patio, and the sound of my footsteps made him look up, a frown of annoyance at the interruption crossing his face. Clara, what are you doing here? Is everything all right? I didn't answer his question. I just stood there, looking at him, letting the silence stretch, letting my presence curdle the comfortable evening air. He began to shift in his chair, putting the magazine down. My voice came out steady, chillingly calm, without a tremor. I read the diaries, Uncle Arthur. The change in his face was subtle but total. The mask of the concerned, practical uncle disintegrated. For a fraction of a second, before he could construct another one, I saw it. The pure, primal panic of a cornered animal. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a wall of stern denial. Diaries? What diaries? Clara, I think the stress of all this is getting to you. Your grandmother didn't keep diaries. She did, 3 of them. She kept them in a tin box in a trunk in the attic. Does that sound familiar? His face paled, but his voice was firm, condescending. You've been up in that dusty attic after I explicitly told you not to. And you found some old storybooks, some teenage fantasy your grandmother wrote and forgot about 60 years ago. This is ridiculous. Her handwriting was very clear. She wrote about Daniel Sullivan. She wrote about you seeing them by the creek. She wrote about the look of disgust on your face. He stood up then, his chair scraping against the stone. He used his height to try and intimidate me, his voice rising. This is character assassination. You're taking the sentimental scribblings of an old woman and twisting them into something ugly. I was a boy. I was loyal to my father, to my family. Something you clearly don't understand. She wrote about the night you sent Daniel away. She wrote, Arthur held my arm as the bus pulled away. I was screaming. Do you remember that, Uncle Arthur? Do you remember the feeling of her fighting you? I remember a hysterical girl who was throwing her life away. I remember saving her from a mistake that would have ruined her. Yes, I remember it, and I was right to do it. And Leo? Was his death for her own good too? That was the word. The forbidden name, the one that held all the power. His rage collapsed into something else, something sputtering and desperate. It was a fever, a tragic, horrible sickness. How dare you suggest otherwise? She was locked in her room, wasn't she? While her son burned with fever, you and your father locked her in her room. You didn't call a doctor. Why? If it was just a sickness, why was she a prisoner? He had no answer. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He was undone. I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. She wrote, They buried my son in the dark. They told me to forget. Did you help bury him, Uncle Arthur? Did you help put him in the ground and then tell your sister to forget her own child? And then he broke. It wasn't a dignified shattering. It was the ugly, total collapse of a lifetime of lies. He sank back into his chair, his face in his hands, and a sound came out of him, a ragged, wretched sob. He made me. Father, he said it was my fault, my responsibility. He said the family had to be cleansed. He said it was a sickness of sin, that God was taking the child. He watched me dig. What was I supposed to do? I was 17. He was my father. I was so scared. I was just so scared. He wept. He wept for the boy he was, for the man he became, for the secret that had hollowed him out. But his tears brought me no peace, no satisfaction. I looked at the broken old man in his expensive wicker chair, surrounded by his perfect life, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. The truth was out, but it had healed nothing. I turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his 70-year-old ghosts. The confrontation with Arthur didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. Vindicating my grandmother's truth felt righteous, but it also felt incomplete. Her story wasn't just one of betrayal and loss at the hands of her family. It began as a story of love, a love that had been violently silenced. Arthur was the guardian of the lie, but there was another witness out there somewhere. A living ghost who had been told a different lie entirely. I owed it to my grandmother and to the ghost of Leo to find him, to tell him he had a son. The search for Daniel Sullivan was an obsession. I pored over online archives, census records, old phone directories. I was a woman possessed. After a week of dead ends, I found him. A retired artist living in a small desert town in New Mexico. For a moment, I considered calling, but a story like this couldn't be told over the phone. It had to be delivered. The relics in the tin box had a final destination. I booked a flight. The entire journey felt surreal. I was flying across the country, carrying a 70-year-old secret in my carry-on bag. The tin box felt heavy on my lap, a condensed note of tragedy and love. I felt like a messenger in a Greek myth, tasked with delivering a truth so profound it could either destroy a man or set him free. Daniel Sullivan lived in a small, modest adobe house that smelled of clay and turpentine. He was a small, frail man, his hands gnarled by arthritis, but his eyes were a startlingly clear blue. The eyes my grandmother had written about. He moved slowly, cautiously, as he led me into his sun-drenched studio. He had agreed to see me after I sent him a short, cryptic letter mentioning I was Alina Harrison's granddaughter and that I had something of hers to give him. We sat in a heavy, expectant silence for a long moment before I could speak. Mr. Sullivan, Daniel, thank you for seeing me. I know this is unusual. His voice was soft, raspy with age. When you get to be my age, not much is unusual. But your letter. I haven't heard Alina's name spoken aloud in a very long time. Is she? She passed away a few weeks ago. I'm so sorry. He closed his clear, blue eyes, a wave of ancient pain passing over his face. He nodded slowly. I didn't say anything else. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed the rusted tin box on the table between us. His eyes fixed on it. She kept this. For 70 years. She wanted someone to find it, I think. I think she wanted you to know what was inside. With trembling hands, he reached out and lifted the lid. He stared into the box. I watched as he carefully, reverently, lifted out the tiny leather shoes. He held one in the palm of his hand, his thumb stroking the cracked leather. He didn't cry. The emotion was too deep, too old for tears. It was a grief that had been petrified. He whispered the words, more to himself than to me. My God, I remember these. We saw them in a shop window, she said. She said they were the perfect shoes for a boy to see the world in. She had a son, Daniel. You had a son. I told him everything then. I told him about the diaries, the birth, the 5 months of secret joy. And I told him about the fever. He listened, his face a mask of profound, motionless sorrow, his gnarled hand never releasing the tiny shoe. They told me he was stillborn, her father. That man looked me in the eye and told me the baby was born sleeping. He called it a mercy. His name was Leo, and she loved him more than anything. She never, ever forgot you. After a long time, he went to a small wooden desk in the corner. He fumbled in a drawer and pulled out a worn sketchbook. From the very back, he extracted a small charcoal sketch, folded carefully. He handed it to me. It was of a leaner, her head thrown back in laughter, a sketch so full of life it seemed to move on the page. On the back, in Daniel's block letters, was one phrase, my Aliner. Forever. She should have this back, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. A promise is a promise. I took the sketch. I had come to deliver a history of sorrow, and in return, he had given me the one thing that had been missing from the box: a single, preserved moment of their pure, untarnished joy. Outro. The flight back from New Mexico was different. I was no longer carrying a burden, I was carrying a gift. The small charcoal sketch felt warm in my pocket, a stark contrast to the cold, heavy weight of the tin box I had carried on the journey out. I had gone seeking the end of a story of tragedy, but Daniel had given me back its beginning. A beginning full of laughter and the promise of a forever that had, in its own strange, heartbreaking way, been kept. The final wish was fulfilled, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth. When I walked back into my grandmother's house, the air had changed. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt peaceful, settled. The ghosts were no longer restless. They had been heard. I walked up to her bedroom and took the small sketch from my pocket. I smoothed it out and placed it in a simple silver frame I had bought. I set it on her bedside table, right where she would have seen it every morning and every night. Eleanor and Daniel, young and deliriously in love, immortalized in charcoal. Her forever finally brought home. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. It was no longer a house of whispers. It was a library of truth, and I was its keeper. My project became the photo albums. I took the original torn photograph, the one that started it all, and carefully mended it. I created a new page at the very front of the oldest album for it, with a small caption: Eleanor and Daniel, 1950. Then I took the photo of Eleanor and her baby from the tin box and gave it its own page. I found the old family Bible, and on the page for births, in a space that had been empty for 70 years, I wrote in my neatest hand, Leo Sullivan. I gave him his father's name, an act of rebellion against my great grandfather's tyranny, a final, definitive correction to the historical record. His life was no longer a shameful secret of the Harrison family. It was now a cherished, acknowledged memory of the Sullivan family. My grandmother's final wish, I finally understood, was not an act of destruction. It was the ultimate act of creation. She could not bring her son back to life, so she did the next best thing. She brought his story back. She knew the silence was the real killer, the poison that had seeped through the generations. Her final act on this earth was to craft a key, write a riddle, and trust that the granddaughter with her eyes would be brave enough to unlock the truth and speak it aloud. We think we know the people who live beside us. We think we know our parents, our grandparents. We see their present, but their pasts are deep, uncharted oceans filled with shipwrecks and lost treasures. The greatest gift you can give them and yourself is to ask about the voyage, to listen to their stories. Don't wait until all you have left is a key and a riddle. Thank you all for taking this long, difficult journey with me and for listening to Eliner's and Daniel's and Leo's story. It means the world to me to be able to share it. If their story touched you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories from the past. Until next time, take care of each other.